Good morning, PIC, and welcome. Greetings once again from the great and very hot, very humid state of Georgia, USA, and the Melton family. This week we'll be looking at an interesting and often confusing question. How do Christians relate to the Old Testament Jewish law? There's quite a bit of static out there about this. Some speakers very loudly and dogmatically tell you that the Old Testament is dead, and with it so is the law. Others seem to say that the law is still important and that we should be paying attention to it. If this seems awkward, know that you aren't alone. This is what the First Jerusalem Council was all about. Do converts to Christianity from outside Judaism need to be circumcised or not? Do they need to follow the law or not? Paul himself spilt more than a little ink on the topic, dealing with it in Romans and Corinthians. So if you don't quite know what to do with the law, you're in good company. But we'll be taking a simple approach. As Christians, we orient ourselves to Christ. We therefore look to his example and see how he oriented himself toward the law. Luckily for us, this isn't something that we have to really piece together from implications. Christ gave us a very clear statement on the matter, found in Matthew 5:17 through 20. So let's take a look at Matthew 5:17 through 23, and let's put it into context. This is part of Jesus' famous Sermon on the Mount. He's just finished with the Beatitudes, which are really simple observations of fact. They're a series of moral cause and effect statements. So, for example, if you are merciful, you will be blessed with mercy. That's just a fact. One cause equals one effect. While my Bible has a section break before verse 13 and after verse 20, I would argue that that's not the best place for those breaks. Verses 13 and 14 are equally factual statements, more similar to verses 1 through 12 than to 17 and beyond. In fact, by the time we get to verse 21, we see that Christ has shifted topic entirely, and now he's dealing with issues covered explicitly by the written Jewish law. It seems pretty clear that verses 17 through 20 are actually his transition from one type of statement to the other. Jesus is about to start dissecting the law, and he needs to explain how he and we relate to the law and why it's important. And so if you look at the scripture here, you should be able to see the shift actually happening. If we don't have this baseline, if we don't know this, nothing that he says in verses 21 through 48 are going to make any sense to us. So these few scriptures are key to understanding Christ's relationship to the law and through it our own. So starting with verse 17. Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish but to fulfill. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law until all is accomplished. Whoever then annuls one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps them and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. You have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court, and whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court, and whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. And this is all from the NASB. Well, as always, it's important to define our terms so that we clearly know what we're talking about and what we're not, a process that oftentimes clears up many issues before they become problems in the first place. So what do I mean when I say the law, and what do I not mean? Well, first off, the law is not the complex set of safeguards that the Jewish people created on their own in order to protect themselves from possibly violating the real law. Those laws were called the Pharisaical law after the sect that created them. For example, God-fearing Jews looked at the lawful statement, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, and they created a complex system of rules to follow to really make sure that they weren't actually working on the Sabbath. For example, there was a limited number of steps that they could take or letters that they could write on that day, and if you did one step too many or wrote one letter too many, you were working and suddenly violating the Sabbath. Those laws are very much human inventions and therefore not God's law. Unfortunately, people often confuse the two. Next, the law is not an arbitrary set of preferences that God gave us because that's the side of the bed He woke up on when He created the universe. And if He woke up on the other side of the bed, maybe He might change His mind in a different universe. Well, the moral law is something that is properly grounded in God's character and nature. It is because He is, and it doesn't change any more than He Himself does. The law is law and not whim, God's or ours. Also, the law is not just a self-help manual given to make you happy, healthy, and terrific. It doesn't just exist because it works, and we don't just relate to it for a design on how to become wealthier or happier or stronger, etc., etc., etc. Yes, when we follow God's advice on life works out the way it was intended, and many of those things will result, but they are an afterthought. For example, here, you could follow Colossians 3:23 and, quote, do all things as unto the Lord, end quote. If you do, you will be a creative, intelligent employee or boss who will likely get high-quality results, and that, of course, can lead to promotions and higher pay and things getting better. But that isn't the point of why Paul tells us to do it. Further, it isn't cause and effect. One day, doing your work as unto the Lord may require you to expose corruption or defend a weaker person, and that could get you fired and labeled a troublemaker, which might make it even more difficult for you to get work in your career field in the future. The law isn't given to make us happy or miserable. Its purposes are much more fundamental. Finally, the law is not present or represented in every single injunction or event given in the Bible. This is a huge topic that we just don't have time to fully unpack. But we have to remember that just because something happened in the Bible, sometimes, even when that something involved God telling someone to do something, it doesn't mean that it is a reflection of the law. There are clearly points in time where God speaks to people for that time, and He doesn't necessarily mean that what He is saying is an absolute moral truth applicable across space and time. For example, God did not intend for all of us to go out and pretend to sacrifice our sons as He asked Abraham to do. There are also rules handed down to the Israelites in the desert that aided them in their travels, such as the order of march, that do not apply to Israel once it had been settled in the land, let alone to us today. Further, just because we see something culturally present in the Bible, it doesn't mean that God wants us to ideally copy it and that God thinks this is better. Jesus wore sandals. Does that mean that Polish Christians should wear sandals in January? Certainly not. Sandals are an incidental part of Middle Eastern culture, and we shouldn't lump wearing them in with the law. So what is the law? It is a reflection of God, His character, His nature, and His essence. It is what flows out of God and into His creation because of who God Himself is. It is law with a capital L. It is the law. If you are a fan of C.S. Lewis, it is the deeper magic from before the dawn of time that Aslan is talking about in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And this also explains why it is essentially impossible for we mere humans to live up to it. And that is what makes the whole idea of the law so terrifying. Worse, the more you understand the law, the more religious you are about it, the worse it becomes. In order for us to be properly reunited with God, we must be perfect in all things, as He Himself is perfect in all things. God cannot tolerate sin or imperfection, and He gave us the law to show us what our imperfections are. But the more we look at it, the more we realize that our imperfections are comparatively endless. No matter how hard we try, no human could ever live a perfectly sinless life. Shoot, we can't even live one sinless day. And that means that no human should ever be reunited with God. The law shows us that we are all deserving of death and hell, completely without hope. It's no wonder then that even Christians are afraid of the law. It reminds us of all our failures and, on its own, rightly terrifies us of what we deserve. We want to cut ourselves off from the law and get as far away from it as we can. Some whole theological schools, like dispensationalism, are built up on that false premise. Dispensationalism takes 2 Timothy 2:15 out of context and uses it as an excuse to completely isolate the Old Testament from our lives as Christians. Other people just find it inconvenient. Having to pay attention to the law gets in the way of how I want to live my life. So what if I feel like working on a Sunday? Isn't that my business? Reasons like this are why so many, especially Protestant preachers, are so quick to object that, as Christians, we aren't under the law. That is true, as we'll see, but often the full meaning of that isn't explained, and we're left with a false impression that the law doesn't matter. Unfortunately, Christ himself didn't leave us the option of any of these supposedly easy outs. As he said, "Do not think that I came to abolish or do away with the law or the prophets." Christ did not come to usher in a new post-law era where the law doesn't matter anymore to anyone. Instead, he tells us that he is the result of the law itself. "I did not come to abolish," he says, "but to fulfill." Christ is therefore not the antithesis of the law, but the culmination of it. He was predicted by the law, and he completed the process that the law began to work during the first light of creation. And that is our hope in the face of lawful terror. He is our hope. What we see is that the law has never been broken or abolished. Instead, by his death on the cross, Christ has satisfied the law on our behalf, fitting us back into the system. He did what we could not do, and we could never do. This means that the law itself is still very much a part of our life and our world, but at the same time, it no longer holds the tyranny over us that it once did. In addition to Christ, Paul speaks more than once about our relationship to the law, and each time he emphasizes that the law is still very much a reality. In Romans 6:15-23, when asked if we should sin because we are not under the law but under grace, he responds emphatically, "May it never be." He goes on to explain that while we are not under law, neither are we lawless, resulting in further lawlessness. Instead, we are slaves to righteousness, resulting in sanctification. Again, in chapter 7, verse 13, when asked, "Is the law sin?" he exclaims, "May it never be." He tells us that it is only through the law that we fully understand what sin is. This is a key point. The law now serves as our compass, and it points us in the right directions. James also emphasizes the role of the law, at least indirectly, and if we understand Paul's point, James' idea becomes clear. In James 2:14-26, he tells us that, "Just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead." What he's getting at is the fact that any real, living faith will be lived out in the real world. If you have faith that says one thing, but your actions are always saying the exact opposite, then it's pretty clear that your faith is practically meaningless. If you believe it, really, you will act on it, plain and simple. How does the law come into this? Well, saying, act on it is all well and good. It certainly sounds great, but what does it actually mean if you don't know what acts to perform? That's like walking up to someone in need of a heart transplant and saying, "Hey, buddy, go heal thyself." He would have to know where to go and what to do in order to save his own life, and if he has no way of knowing what steps to take, saying anything to him about it is useless. In the same way, what use is it to tell us, "Go do good works," if we have no way of knowing what good works look like? The law is the answer. As a reflection of God's nature, the law helps us to distinguish the morally good from the morally bad. So, rather than being a threat to our Christian walk, the law is actually important to any Christian walk. So what did I mean when I said that it was correct that we are no longer under the law? What it means is that the place of the law and our relationship to it has fundamentally changed. The law is now our guide. It is no longer our judge. We can go to the law to learn, and we need not approach it in fear. The law is no longer the source of our salvation. Christ himself is clear on this point. While he emphasizes that no one should ever annul even the least of the commandments, he also makes it clear that even those who do still have a place in the kingdom of heaven. We might be the least in the kingdom of heaven, but we have to be in it to begin with to be the least one there. So keeping the law isn't what saves us. Christ has already accomplished that. But how seriously we take it will affect our standing once we're there. This is where thinking of the Christian life as nothing more than fire insurance fails miserably. The Christian life is so much more than just a get-out-of-jail-free card. Heaven isn't an all-or-nothing proposition, and Christ tells us that we should be building our store in the kingdom so that we can realize great reward when we get there. Christ's sacrifice was ultimately about restoring balance to the universe, and a key part of that is the process of restoring ourselves to our proper place in the universe and in relationship to Him. The law is a part of that. We see it further in Paul's discussions of the weaker brother in Romans mentioned earlier, and also in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. There, Paul makes it clear that Christians have freedom from following all the details of the law, especially the Pharisaical laws, but he also asks more mature believers to be sensitive to those who do not yet understand this and might be harmed by their misunderstanding of that freedom. That could easily be a profitable sermon in and of itself, but the point here is that in Paul's spiritual economy, both the stronger brother who enjoys freedom and the weaker brother who still follows the law intently equally enjoy salvation. Working out these particular matters of conscience, important as they are, is something that happens apart from salvation. So what does all this mean for us? What purpose does the law still serve for us since it's no longer about salvation? Well, here are 4 points to consider. First, the law provides us with a useful counterpoint to our freedom. It creates what I call a useful tension that helps us to balance out our freedom. Humans tend to do things in extremes, and if you give them only one point of reference, they'll almost always overdo it. In this case, if we only know freedom, we will have a tendency to abuse it, to move into sin and licentiousness. Paul himself remarked on that when, as we said, he asked if he should sin more so that grace might abound more. May it never be. At the same time, if we have only the law, we will tend to be legalistic, frustrated, and angry. By giving us both freedom and law, and asking us to use both at the same time, God has made it possible to find a better balance. In the tension between the two, we can discover what we might call a tempered freedom. We find a way to live freely and at the same time live rightly, justly, and do good. Next, anyone who has ever lived the Christian life for long, if they have really lived it, knows that the Christian life is a process. When the excitement of our first mountaintop experience fades into a valley, we learn that it is also very hard work. We aren't instantly angels living perfect lives. God has to guide us through the gradual transformation from the old into the new. Getting to know the law as our guide is a way to illuminate that path. Again, we have to be sensitive to the differences between the deeper, more foundational moral laws and those that were given in limited certain places and certain times. But the Holy Spirit, context, and common sense are reliable guides. All told, they give us much more to go on than just a feeling, and the law is an important part of that. Next, our attempts to live according to the deeper law is a sign of our serious pursuit of Christ and the practical working out of our salvation. This is what James is talking about with his references to a living faith, and what Christ himself meant when he talked about the tree bearing fruit. If we truly love Christ and follow him, if we have an actual living, growing faith, then our lives will show it. In that sense, a healthy relationship and an understanding of the law is one of the most important points of reference we can use to understand how our faith is developing. Finally, the law serves as a mirror in which we can fully understand the depth of our depravity and the miracle of our salvation. In it, we see Christ's sacrifice, what it entailed, and what it purchased with crystal clarity. The realization of how terrifying the law is makes us appreciate Christ in ways that would otherwise be impossible. Imagine walking up to some random stranger on the street who's just minding his or her own business and saying, "Aren't you glad that you were saved from that horrible fate?" He or she will probably look at you like you were crazy. Why? Because he or she never knew there was any danger. As far as they were concerned, this day was like any other. There was nothing to be afraid of. And so if there was nothing to be afraid of, why would you feel grateful for being saved? The law introduces us to our danger. It reveals our sin and makes us feel the depth of it. And it shows us how much Christ's sacrifice for us actually means. Once we fully understand that, it makes real relief and true gratitude actually possible. So if you haven't spent time reading the Old Testament or looking into the law, it is very much worth your time as a believer. Rather than laying down the law, I would suggest you pick it up. In getting to know it, we get to know its fulfillment better, Christ himself. Have a great week.